What if saving a life changes yours forever? A nurse donates blood to a stranger, unaware that he's a millionaire, a single dad, and the man who will soon turn her world upside down. She thought it was just another shift, but sometimes the smallest act of kindness leads to a love story no one saw coming. Stay with me to find out how one simple choice could reshape everything. It was just another day in the emergency room of St. Vincent's Hospital, Los Angeles. The rhythmic beeping of monitors, the rapid shuffle of nurses and doctors rushing. Between rooms, the constant hum of phones ringing off the hook. This was the pulse of the hospital, the heart of the chaos. It was a place where time often felt like it moved faster than the human body could keep up. And yet, everyone was moving in sync, guided by the unspoken urgency of saving lives. Grace Thompson, a young dedicated nurse, moved swiftly through the ER. Her dark brown hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and her surgical scrubs were already starting to feel too tight from the sweat building on her brow. She had been on shift for 6 hours straight, but to Grace it didn't matter. She had always been the type of person who thrived in high-pressure situations, finding comfort in the noise, in the relentless flow of patients who needed attention, each one a ticking clock. "Room 3 needs sutures," a voice called out from across the hallway. "I'm on it," Grace responded without breaking stride. Her body moved almost on autopilot, her mind focused on the task at hand. There was no time to stop, no room for hesitation. In the ER, there was always someone who needed saving, and Grace had learned long ago to put her own exhaustion aside to help. As she turned the corner to head toward room 3, the double doors to the ER burst open with a suddenness that made Grace's pulse quicken. The paramedics entered, flanking a gurney as they wheeled in a man who appeared to be in his mid-30s. His face was pale, his chest wrapped in bandages, and a deep gash across his abdomen was already soaking through the gauze. His breathing was shallow, and the rise and fall of his chest seemed more like a struggle than a normal motion. "Car accident on the 405, one of the paramedics shouted over the noise. "BP's dropping fast. Internal bleeding suspected." Grace's stomach tightened as she watched them wheel him through the narrow hallway. She immediately recognized the urgency of the situation. This wasn't just another routine case. This man's life hung in the balance, and every second counted. Dr. Harper, one of the senior ER doctors, was already pulling on his gloves, his face grim as he assessed the patient. "What's his blood type?" Dr. Harper called, his voice steady but urgent. "AB negative," a nurse answered, quickly typing into the system. A curse escaped Dr. Harper's lips, barely audible. "We're out of AB negative," he muttered, glancing at the blood supply chart on the wall. "The last unit was used in surgery an hour ago." Grace's eyes flicked to the patient on the gurney. The sight of him, so helpless and vulnerable, sent a pang of guilt through her chest. She knew they didn't have time to wait for another unit of blood to be delivered from another hospital. If they didn't act fast, this man could be gone before anyone had a chance to do anything. Without thinking, Grace stepped forward, her voice cutting through the frantic noise of the room. "I'm AB negative," she said firmly. The room fell silent. The other nurses and doctors turned to look at her, a mix of surprise and hesitation on their faces. She understood their hesitation. Donating blood mid-shift was unheard of, especially when there were so many patients to care for. But Grace didn't hesitate. She didn't need to be asked twice. "I'm healthy, cleared, no medications," she continued, her voice steady. "I can give what's needed." Dr. Harper blinked, his eyes narrowing as he processed what she was saying. He glanced at the patient again, then at the IV bag that had already been set up for the transfusion. His expression shifted, and after a moment he gave a sharp nod. "Get her to transfusion now," he ordered. Grace didn't question him. Without a word, she turned and walked towards the transfusion room. Her pulse was racing, not from fear but from the adrenaline that had surged through her veins. This wasn't about following orders anymore. It was about making a difference in someone's life. A stranger's life. As the needle slid into her arm, Grace's thoughts briefly flickered to her own family. Her mother, back in New York, had always told her to make a difference in the world. "Even the smallest action can change someone's life," her mother would say, and Grace had never forgotten it. The blood filled the bag with a steady flow, and she watched it, the deep red color slowly collecting in the plastic, like a life force being shared between two strangers. The nurse beside her gave her a concerned look. "You sure about this?" "Donating blood in the middle of your shift?" she asked softly. Grace gave a small smile, though her eyes never left the bag. "What's the alternative?" she asked quietly. "Let someone die because it's inconvenient?" The nurse didn't argue. She simply nodded and continued with the procedure, as Grace's blood was taken, labeled, and rushed into surgery to save the man on the operating table. As soon as the donation was complete, Grace felt an odd sense of relief. Her body ached with fatigue, but there was a strange calmness that settled in her chest. She knew what she had done wasn't about seeking recognition or validation. It was about doing what needed to be done. But there was a part of her deep inside that wondered if anyone would ever truly understand the cost of such an act. Not just physically, but emotionally. She had just given something precious, a part of herself, to a stranger. A life had been saved. But what had it cost her? The rest of the night passed in a blur. Grace kept moving, her feet carrying her from patient to patient, each one a reminder that life could be fragile, that there was no time to waste. The adrenaline from her earlier actions had worn off, replaced by an all-consuming fatigue. But, no matter how tired she felt, there was a small part of her that still felt alive with purpose. By the time morning came, the patient had survived his surgery. He was stable. His heart was still beating. Grace couldn't help but feel a sense of pride at what she had done, but there was something more, something that tugged at her heart, something that wouldn't let go. She walked down the hallway, passing the nurse's station when she overheard a paramedic talking to a colleague in hushed tones. His daughter's 6. She's with a neighbor now, asking if her dad's going to be okay. The words hit Grace like a physical blow. A daughter, a little girl waiting for her father. She stopped in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. The man she had saved was someone's father, someone's world. The realization hit her with an unexpected force, and suddenly, the long hours, the exhaustion, the pain in her body, all of it faded away, because she had saved him. And that little girl would get to see her father again. It wasn't much, but in that moment, Grace knew she had made a difference. She had saved a life, not for recognition, not for applause, but because it was the right thing to do. And sometimes that was enough. The sun rose over Los Angeles, casting a soft golden light through the windows of St. Vincent's Hospital. The energy of the night shift had faded, and the emergency room buzzed with the steady rhythm of morning routines, less chaotic but no less critical. Grace stood at the nurse's station, her eyes scanning through patient files, trying to keep her mind busy when her phone buzzed in her pocket. A quick glance told her it was a message from Maya, her best friend since nursing school. Alive or dead? Grace smiled softly and quickly typed back, "Barely alive. The ER never stops, you know that. Want to get breakfast tomorrow? I'm in need of your brutal honesty. Only if there's coffee. You owe me." Grace chuckled and put the phone back in her pocket. The exhaustion from the night before still lingered in her bones, but she had learned to push through it. There was always something, someone that needed her. But as she made her way down the hallway, she felt an unfamiliar tug in her chest. The events of the night, though routine for someone in her profession, had left a lasting impact on her. The face of the man she had saved, though she hadn't seen it clearly, was now imprinted on her mind. She couldn't stop thinking about the little girl Sophie, who was waiting for her dad. Grace turned the corner, heading toward the break room when she spotted him. Ethan, the man she had helped save, the one whose life she had donated her blood. Tu was standing by the coffee machine in the hallway, leaning against the wall. His shoulder was slightly hunched, a quiet indication of the pain that still lingered from the accident. His face, though pale and tired, was undeniably handsome. His eyes were dark but soft, and there was a vulnerability about him that Grace hadn't expected. His gaze lifted as she approached, and for a moment there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. He gave her a polite nod, his lips curving into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Hi," he said, his voice low but warm. "You're Grace, right?" Grace's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected him to recognize her. After all, she hadn't seen his face the night of the surgery, and he had been unconscious when she donated her blood. Still, there was something about the way he spoke, as if he knew her more than just as the nurse who had saved him. "I am," Grace replied, offering a polite smile in return. "How are you feeling?" Ethan hesitated, his hand resting lightly on the edge of the coffee machine as if searching for balance. "Better, thanks to you," he said softly. You really saved my life." Grace's eyes softened and her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected him to be so direct, so open with his gratitude. She simply nodded, unsure of what to say. It wasn't that she didn't want to talk about it, but in moments like this, it always felt like words fell short. "I'm just doing my job," she said finally, offering a smile that was more for herself than for him. Ethan's gaze lingered on her for a moment, his expression shifting. He seemed to be processing something deeper, as if there was more he wanted to say but didn't know how to put it into words. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to thank you enough," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't even know me." "I don't need to know you," Grace answered quickly. "You're here and that's what matters." Ethan smiled again, but it was tinged with a sadness that Grace couldn't quite place. "I'm not sure how I would have made it through this without you." Before Grace could respond, a small voice interrupted their conversation. "Daddy, there you are." The little girl, Sophie, appeared at the end of the hallway, her pigtails bouncing with every step as she ran toward Ethan. Ethan's face softened as he crouched to catch her in his arms, lifting her effortlessly into his embrace. Sophie's small arms wrapped around his neck as she whispered something into his ear, her voice barely audible to Grace. Ethan's smile deepened as he kissed the top of his daughter's head. "Hey, kiddo, how's your day going?" he asked, his voice tender and filled with affection. Sophie beamed at him, her eyes sparkling with an innocence that made Grace's heart ache. "I was playing with the bubbles outside and I caught 2 of them, Daddy. You should have seen." Ethan laughed softly, his eyes full of warmth as he stood up, still holding Sophie in his arms. "I'll bet you did. You're pretty amazing. You know that?" Grace watched them interact, feeling a sense of warmth spread through her chest. There was a simplicity and purity in their relationship that was undeniable. Ethan's love for his daughter was so evident, and the way Sophie looked at him with such admiration. It was enough to make anyone believe in the power of family, of love. As they exchanged pleasantries, Grace couldn't help but feel an odd connection to them both. She had helped save Ethan's life, but there was something about Sophie's smile, the way she looked at her dad with such admiration, that struck her deeply. She felt a sense of responsibility toward them both, but it wasn't the same kind of responsibility she felt toward her patients. This was different. It was personal. It wasn't long before Ethan and Sophie disappeared down the hallway to another part of the hospital, their laughter echoing as they walked together. Grace stood there for a moment, her heart heavy with emotion. She hadn't expected to feel this way. She had saved many lives before, but something about this man and his daughter, it was different. She didn't know what it was, but she couldn't shake the feeling that their lives were intertwined somehow. Not just because she had given him her blood, but because their stories had crossed paths in a way that was almost too fateful to be a coincidence. Grace shook her head, trying to push the thoughts away. She wasn't one to dwell on emotions. She had a job to do. But as she watched Ethan and Sophie disappear around the corner, she couldn't help but wonder what would come next. The following day, after a long shift, Grace found herself reflecting again. She couldn't help but replay the events of the past 2 days. She knew this was how life worked. Constant movement, constant change. But there was something about Ethan's situation that had struck a chord with her. The way his daughter depended on him. The way he was slowly coming back from the brink of death, and how his whole world had shifted because of a stranger's blood. But more than that, Grace began to think about what it meant for her. She had saved him, yes, but had she truly saved herself in the process? The morning after their first encounter, Grace sat in the hospital cafeteria sipping her coffee. She had been up late again, unable to sleep, her mind racing with the questions she had been too afraid to ask herself. What was it about Ethan that felt so significant? And what did her act of kindness mean in the grand scheme of things? Her phone buzzed, bringing her back to reality. It was Maya again. "You up for the breakfast of champions? Coffee and deep thoughts are my specialty." Grace smiled and typed back, "I think I could use a little of both." But as she sent the message, something tugged at her, something that had been there all along, but now felt more undeniable than ever. Maybe, just maybe, she had been part of something bigger than herself. Saving Ethan was an act of kindness, but it was also a connection that could reshape both of their lives in ways they hadn't expected. As the days passed, Grace found herself hoping for more. Maybe this was the beginning of something. Maybe it was more than just a stranger's blood saving a man's life. Maybe, somewhere in that act of giving, there was an opportunity for a new kind of healing. And just like that, Grace realized something that startled her. She didn't just want to help people for the sake of doing her job anymore. There was something more she longed for, something she hadn't been willing to admit. Maybe it was a connection, a new beginning that she had never thought she deserved. but now it was possible. Maybe it was time to stop running from it. Grace spent the next few days carefully balancing the demands of her job and the gnawing curiosity about Ethan. The more she tried to dismiss the thoughts, the more they surfaced, unbidden and relentless. In her mind, he was a stranger, yet the connection between them felt undeniable. She had given him her blood, a piece of herself, in a moment of intense urgency, but now she was beginning to wonder if that act of kindness had opened the door to something much more complicated than saving a life. It wasn't just that she had donated blood, it was the way Ethan had looked at her, the raw vulnerability in his eyes. The gratitude, sure, but also something deeper, something she couldn't quite name. It had shaken her, stirred something inside her that she had spent years trying to bury. But she wasn't supposed to think about it. She wasn't supposed to think about him. The shift had been long, and Grace found herself looking at the clock more often than she'd like to admit. It was late in the afternoon, and the ER was beginning to settle into a lull. The hustle and bustle from earlier had quieted down, and Grace, though exhausted, felt a rare moment of peace. It wasn't often that she got to breathe for a few minutes, but she knew better than to think it would last long. A nurse's life was never predictable, and in the ER there was no such thing as downtime. Her shift partner Sarah glanced over from the other side of the nurse's station and gave her a knowing look. "You look like you're miles away," Sarah remarked with a small smile. "You okay?" Grace offered a tight smile in return, not wanting to let on just how much her mind had been consumed lately. "Just thinking," she replied vaguely. Sarah raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "About?" Grace hesitated, chewing on her lower lip. She could say anything, about the difficult patient they had just finished treating, about the heavy toll the shift had taken on her, but the truth was, her thoughts had been circling Ethan. And how could she even begin to explain that? How could she tell Sarah that there was a man, a single father, whose life she had saved, and now she couldn't stop thinking about him? She opted for something less revealing. "Nothing too important," she said finally, shrugging it off. "Just tired." Sarah nodded but seemed to sense the lie. She didn't press further. Grace appreciated that. Sometimes it was easier to keep things to herself than to try to explain emotions that she didn't fully understand. Later that evening, Grace found herself in the hospital's break room, sipping on a cup of water, her thoughts once again drifting back to Ethan. The words he had spoken to her, the way he had looked at her, all felt like they had come from a place of raw honesty. But in the back of her mind, the doubts crept in. Was it just gratitude? Was that all it was? Or was there something more? It wasn't that she was afraid of connections. She had seen countless relationships form between the doctors and nurses at the hospital. It wasn't even the risk of heartbreak, though that was a valid concern given her history. No, it was something deeper. It was the idea of vulnerability. She had spent so many years protecting herself, building walls that kept her emotions at bay, and now a single encounter had made her wonder if those walls were meant to be torn down. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. Maya had texted again. "So, spill. What's going on with you? You've been distant lately. I'm starting to think you're avoiding me." Grace smiled to herself, appreciating her friend's persistent need to know everything. She quickly typed back, "It's been a long few days, just tired." Maya wasn't buying it. "Long days, huh? You sure that's all? Because you sound like someone who's been thinking a lot, and I know you too well to let you off the hook." Grace laughed softly and replied, "It's just work stuff. You know how it is." Maya didn't respond immediately, which was unusual. Grace could almost hear her friend's thoughts, the skepticism. Maya knew her better than anyone. Grace could already imagine Maya's next message, one of her characteristic probes that always seemed to hit a little too close to home. Just as she expected, Maya replied, "Are you sure? Because something tells me it's not just work. You've got that look on your face like you've met someone. Is it a doctor, a new patient, or a millionaire who's also a single dad?" Grace's heart skipped a beat. She had never mentioned Ethan to Maya, but the way her friend zeroed in on it made Grace feel like she'd been caught in the act. Grace quickly typed, "What are you talking about?" "No, just tired." Maya's next message came through faster than Grace could prepare herself for. "I know you, Grace, and I know when you're avoiding something. Spill. Tell me what's really going on." Grace hesitated, staring at the screen. How could she explain this? How could she tell Maya that she had donated blood to a man, a complete stranger, and that now she couldn't stop thinking about him? About how his eyes had locked with hers and how he'd said thank you in a way that made her feel seen, not just as a nurse but as a person. It's nothing, really, just complicated. But the thing was, Grace knew Maya wasn't going to let her drop it, and deep down Grace knew she didn't want to. She didn't want to brush off what was becoming something more than just a passing thought. The next day, Grace found herself outside the pediatric wing when she spotted him again, Ethan. This time, he was sitting on a bench in the small courtyard, a smile on his face as Sophie ran around chasing bubbles. He looked at ease, and there was a certain peace about him now that she hadn't seen before. As Grace stood at the edge of the courtyard, watching the scene unfold before her, a gentle wind blew through the trees, and for a moment it felt like the world had paused, holding its breath. She knew this moment would change everything. She could feel it in her chest, this tight ache that wouldn't go away. The act of kindness she had given so freely was now becoming something more, something personal, something real. She stepped forward, her heart beating faster than it should have been, and as if by some cosmic force, Ethan's eyes met hers. For a brief moment, there was a flicker of recognition in his gaze, a soft acknowledgement. He didn't speak at first, but the silent connection between them was loud enough. "Grace," he said finally, standing up. Sophie, oblivious to the exchange, continued to play with her bubbles. "You're off shift?" Grace nodded, feeling a little caught off guard by the sudden warmth of his presence. "Yeah, just finished." There was a pause, and for the first time she really looked at him. Ethan wasn't just a patient she had helped save. He wasn't just the father of a little girl who had reminded her of the importance of family. No, there was something more here. A depth in his eyes, a shared understanding of something unspoken. Something neither of them had the words for yet. "You look better," Grace remarked. "How's the recovery going?" "Much better," Ethan said with a smile. "Thanks to you, I'm still here. I'll be forever grateful for what you did." His words were simple, but the weight behind them was undeniable. Grace felt her breath catch in her throat. She had heard his gratitude before, but this time it felt different. This time his words weren't just about saving his life. They were about something more. About a connection that was slowly building between them. Peace. By peace, one unspoken moment at a time. Sophie, still unaware of the subtle exchange between them, ran over to Ethan, her face lighting up as she held out her hand. "Look, Daddy, I caught more bubbles." Ethan laughed and took her hand, gently guiding her back to the bench. Grace watched them, feeling that familiar tug in her chest, the ache of wanting something she couldn't quite name. And as Ethan sat back down, holding Sophie close, Grace found herself standing there, unsure of what to say, but knowing this moment right here, was the beginning of something more. The next few days felt like a whirlwind to Grace. Between her long shifts, the non-stop flow of patients, and the quiet tension that had begun to build around her encounters with Ethan, she found herself walking through the hospital in a fog. Her thoughts were consumed by him in a way that was hard to ignore, and the more she tried to push those feelings away, the stronger they seemed to grow. She had always prided herself on being able to separate her emotions from her work, but this was different. Ethan and Sophie had somehow wormed their way into her heart, and the walls she had so carefully built were slowly crumbling down. But it wasn't just Ethan that occupied her mind. It was everything that had come with him. His vulnerability, his quiet gratitude, the bond he shared with his daughter. All of it made Grace want to understand more, want to know him better, even if it meant exposing parts of herself she wasn't ready to share. It was late one evening when Grace's routine was shattered again. She had just finished checking on a few patients when Dr. Harper, the senior doctor, approached her in the hallway with a stern look on his face. "Grace," he said, his voice clipped, "we've got a situation. It's Ethan. He's back in for a complication. I need you to help prep him for surgery." Grace's heart skipped a beat. Ethan. What had happened? She tried to steady her breath, but it felt like the floor had suddenly dropped from under her. "Is he okay?" she asked, unable to keep the concern from her voice. Dr. Harper nodded grimly. "It's a setback. Internal bleeding from the surgery. He's refusing to go through more tests, but we're going to have to go in and fix it. He doesn't have a choice." Before Grace could respond, Dr. Harper turned and started down the hallway. Grace followed, her mind racing. Internal bleeding. She had known that Ethan had been through a lot, but she hadn't realized how dire the situation still was. When they arrived at Ethan's room, Grace was struck by how fragile he looked, lying there in the sterile hospital bed. His normally strong and confident demeanor was replaced by a quiet, almost defeated air. His eyes were closed, and he looked so different from the man she had first encountered, so much more vulnerable. She could barely recognize the man who had laughed with his daughter just days earlier, the man who had smiled at her with that quiet intensity. Ethan's eyes opened slowly as Grace entered, and his gaze immediately locked with hers. There was something in his eyes, something raw, something that tore at Grace's heart. "Grace," he said hoarsely, his voice barely a whisper, "I didn't want you to see me like this." Grace moved closer, her heart aching for him. "Ethan, you don't have to apologize," she said softly. "You're going to be okay. We're going to fix this." But even as she spoke, she wasn't sure if she believed it. He looked so fragile, so broken, and the fear that had been lingering in his eyes when she first walked in made her wonder if he was scared of more than just the surgery. Was he afraid of losing the one person who meant everything to him? His daughter. Ethan shifted in the bed, wincing as he adjusted his position. His face tightened with pain, but he tried to hide it behind a weak smile. I don't know if I can go through this again," he admitted, his voice cracking. "I've already lost so much. I'm not sure I can handle losing more." Grace felt a lump form in her throat at his words. She didn't know what to say. What could she say to someone who had already endured so much? But then she remembered something that had been said to her once, a long time ago, by a mentor. Sometimes you don't need to say anything. Sometimes just being there is enough. Without thinking, Grace reached out and gently took Ethan's hand. His fingers tightened around hers, and in that moment it felt like the entire world had quieted down. There was nothing else in that room except the two of them. Two souls caught in a moment of shared vulnerability. "You're not alone, Ethan," Grace said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to do this by yourself." For a long moment, he didn't respond. Then slowly, his eyes met hers, and she saw something she hadn't seen before. Trust. A quiet, deep trust. "I don't know if I can make it through this," he said, his voice trembling. "But you gave me a second chance. You saved my life. And I don't even know how to thank you for that." Grace shook her head, her grip on his hand tightening. "I didn't do it for thanks, Ethan. I did it because you have a daughter who needs you. And I couldn't just let you go." The room fell into a heavy silence as they both took in the gravity of the situation. Grace felt her chest tighten, the weight of her emotions almost too much to bear. She had never imagined that something so simple, something as straightforward as donating blood, could lead to moments like this. Moments where lives were intertwined in ways that went beyond anything she had ever experienced. And then just as suddenly as the silence had settled, Ethan broke it again, this time with a question that made Grace's heart race. "Why did you do it?" he asked, his voice quiet but intense. "Why did you help me? We were strangers." "I don't even know." "Your full name?" Grace swallowed hard. She wasn't sure how to answer him. The truth was, it wasn't just about saving him. It was about something deeper, something that had nothing to do with her professional duty and everything to do with her own heart. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "It felt like the right thing to do. I couldn't just let you die. But part of me knew I needed to help for more than just your physical health. I saw the way your daughter looked at you. I couldn't let her lose you. I guess, in a way, I needed to save you because I knew what it would mean to her. And I think somewhere I needed to save myself too." The words hung in the air, their weight settling over the both of them. Ethan looked at her, his eyes searching her face, as if trying to understand the complexity of the feelings that swirled between them. "You've already saved me, Grace," he said quietly. "But I'm not sure I deserve it. I don't know if I can be the man I need to be. For her. For me." Grace didn't know how to respond to that. She wasn't sure there was an answer. She just knew that she couldn't let him give up, not when he had already come so far. "You're not alone in this," she said again, her voice steady. "And you don't have to do it alone. You've got me. And you've got Sophie." Ethan's expression softened, the fear in his eyes giving way to something else, something that resembled hope. It was a small shift, but to Grace it meant everything. As the hours passed, they prepped Ethan for surgery. Grace stayed by his side until the last possible moment, her hand still gripping his as they wheeled him into the operating room. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew this. She had done everything she could for him, and she had made a choice, one that had changed both their lives forever. Later that night, as Grace walked through the quiet hallways of the hospital, she couldn't shake the image of Ethan's face, the vulnerability, the trust, and the raw honesty of his emotions. She had saved him. But what she hadn't expected was how much he had saved her in return. For the first time in a long time, Grace realized that she wasn't just doing this for the job, for the duty, for the hours. She was doing it because there was something more waiting for her, something that was slowly unfolding, piece by piece, just like the connection she had found with Ethan. And no matter what the future held, she was finally ready to face it. The days following Ethan's surgery were a blur. Grace found herself back in the routine of long shifts, her mind still occupied by the intensity of the events that had unfolded. Despite the hectic pace of the hospital, there was a quiet tension in her chest, a feeling that something had shifted. Something, deep within her, something she couldn't ignore. Ethan had pulled through, his surgery successful, and he was on the road to recovery, but Grace knew that the bond they had formed wasn't just about saving a life. It was about what had grown between them since that night. She couldn't pinpoint when it had started, but she knew it now. She had feelings for Ethan, real, complicated feelings. But it wasn't just the physical act of saving him. No, it was the way he had opened up to her, the way he had allowed her to be part of something so deeply personal. She had never known anyone to trust her the way he had. And it wasn't just the gratitude, though there was plenty of that. It was his vulnerability, the way he let down his guard when he was at his most fragile. Grace had seen the quiet pain in his eyes, the fear of losing not just his health, but everything that had mattered to him. And she had stood there by his side, not as a nurse, but as someone who wanted to help him heal. The connection between them had deepened in ways that Grace couldn't have expected. She had thought it was just a fleeting moment, a kind act in the heat of the moment. But as the days passed, she realized it was something much more profound. It was as if they had both been searching for something without even knowing it. And now that they had found each other, they were both uncertain about how to move forward. One afternoon, a few days after Ethan's surgery, Grace was walking through the hospital's pediatric wing when she spotted him again. Ethan was sitting in the waiting area, looking a little more himself, though there was still a slight pallor to his face. His daughter Sophie was with him, her pigtails bouncing as she chatted excitedly about something she had learned in school that day. The sight of them together, a father and daughter so devoted to one another, warmed Grace's heart. There was something incredibly tender about the way they interacted. Ethan's smile, though tired, was full of love for Sophie. And Sophie, with her wide eyes and unrestrained energy, seemed to light up every room she entered. It was easy to see why Ethan had been so desperate to survive, because he had something worth living for. Grace paused for a moment, watching them interact. Ethan caught her gaze from across the room, and for a brief second their eyes locked. There was no need for words. There was a quiet understanding between them now, one that had formed over days of shared experiences, vulnerability, and care. "Grace," Ethan said softly as she approached. "Hey, how's your shift going?" Grace smiled, though it was laced with the heaviness of everything she was feeling. "Busy as usual. How are you feeling?" "Better," Ethan replied, his voice a little stronger. "The doctors say I'm healing well, but it's going to take time. Sophie's been keeping me busy, though." Sophie, who had been sitting on the floor with a toy, looked up at Grace and beamed. "Hi, Grace. I made you a picture at school today," she said, running over to hand Grace a crumpled piece of paper. Grace bent down and accepted the drawing, her heart swelling with affection for the little girl. "Thank you, Sophie. It's beautiful," she said, studying the colorful scribbles. "I'll keep it," Sophie grinned. "It's a picture of me and Daddy and you," she said, pointing at the vague shapes in the drawing. Grace's heart fluttered. She hadn't realized how much Sophie had come to care for her in such a short time. Ethan's eyes softened as he watched his daughter. "She's been talking about you a lot," he said quietly. "I don't think she's ever had a nurse like you before." Grace chuckled, the warmth of the moment settling over her. "I'm just doing my job," she replied. But there was an unspoken meaning behind her words. She wasn't just doing her job anymore. She had become part of their lives, and in return, they had become part of hers. The conversation drifted from casual topics to something deeper, something more real. Ethan and Grace spoke about their lives outside of the hospital, about their hopes for the future, and about the challenges they had faced. It wasn't a date, but it felt like the beginning of something new, a new understanding between them, a new kind of connection. After a while, Sophie's attention was diverted by a nurse who called her name for her checkup, and she scampered off toward the exam room, leaving Grace and Ethan alone. As soon as Sophie was out of earshot, Ethan turned to Grace, his expression more serious now. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," he began. "About not being alone. About not having to do this on my own." Grace's breath caught in her throat. She had said those words to him during his recovery, but now hearing him repeat them made everything feel more tangible. "Ethan, you don't have to," he interrupted her gently. "No, I mean it, Grace. I've been through a lot these past few weeks, and I've had some time to think. You're right. I've spent so much time pushing people away, trying to protect myself and Sophie from getting hurt again. But I'm not doing that anymore." Grace looked at him, her heart racing. "What do you mean?" Ethan's voice was quiet but firm. "I mean that I want to stop living in fear. I want to stop hiding from what could be. And what I see when I look at you, Grace, is someone who's real. Someone who's not afraid of doing the hard thing, even if it's not easy." Grace swallowed, her emotions rising in a wave she hadn't anticipated. "Ethan, Before she could finish her thought, Ethan stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "I don't know what the future holds, Grace. But I know that I want to try. I want to try with you." Her heart pounded in her chest. Was this it? Was this the moment where everything she had been trying to ignore, her feelings, her connection to him, was finally laid bare? "I don't know what's going to happen either," Grace said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "But I know that I want to see where this goes." Ethan smiled, a real smile this time, one that reached his eyes. "Then let's find out together." In the weeks that followed, Grace and Ethan's relationship continued to evolve. They spent more time together, not just as patient and nurse, but as two people who had found something deeper in each other, something worth fighting for. They went on walks, had quiet dinners together, and spent afternoons playing with Sophie, watching as the little girl flourished in the warmth of the love that surrounded her. Ethan continued to recover, both physically and emotionally, and Grace was there for him every step of the way. The bond between them grew stronger, built on trust, vulnerability, and the shared understanding that life wasn't just about surviving. It was about living. And so, life moved forward. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't without challenges, but it was real. And for the first time in a long time, Grace felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. A year later, the hospital courtyard was alive with energy. It had become a tradition to hold an annual blood drive in honor of those who had been saved. And this year, it was even more special. As Grace stood near the stage, clipboard in hand, watching the crowd of people, doctors, nurses, patients, and volunteers gather to celebrate life, her heart swelled with pride. Ethan was by her side, holding Sophie's hand as they looked out over the crowd. Their family had grown in ways they hadn't imagined, and the love they shared had become a beacon of hope for others. Sophie, now 7, stood beside them, holding a sign that read "A Drop of Hope." She looked up at Grace, smiling with that same infectious energy. "Ready?" Grace asked, her voice filled with emotion. Sophie nodded, her eyes sparkling. "Ready." And as Grace stepped forward, holding the microphone in her hand, she felt something shift inside her, a deep sense of gratitude for everything that had led to this moment. "Thank you all for being here today," she began, her voice steady. "Not just for donating blood, but for believing in the power of kindness, of giving, and of love. We are all here because of the connections we've made, because we've chosen to show up for one another, even when it's hard. And today, I want to honor those who have given a part of themselves to save another." As the applause grew louder, Grace glanced at Ethan and Sophie, her heart full. This was their life now, a life filled with love, hope, and the knowledge that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change the world, and together they would face whatever the future held, side by side, heart to heart. If this story touches you, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to Fortune's Wrath, where each story is a reminder that even the quietest choices can reverberate throughout a lifetime. Until the next story, continue to believe that love heals and kindness endures.